Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus, your new essential podcast for trusted aviation insight. My name's Jon Hemmerdinger, FlightGlobal's aerospace managing editor, coming to you from sunny Sarasota, Florida. And today we're going to be dissecting the state of the advanced air mobility market, otherwise known as AAM, and air taxis. Just a few years ago, the sector was full of optimism, with confident predictions that by 2025 we'd all be flitting around in electric air taxis, booking them like we do Ubers, enjoying effortless, inexpensive hops from airport to downtown. Fast forward to today, and that golden future yet remains just a concept, still out of reach. Various startups have found the work of developing and certifying these battery-powered vertical aircraft to be much more difficult than they projected. Joining me to talk over the topic is FlightGlobal's European aerospace editor, Dominic Perry in London.
Hello there.
I forget the exact number, Dom, but at one stage, the Vertical Flight Society said more than 250 eVTOL-type projects, air taxis, were in development. And those included all manner of different aircraft and wild and crazy ideas, some of which were never even intended for production. But the number of aircraft that were under development several years ago really reflected this industry that was brimming with optimism. And at the time, investors were throwing boatloads of money at the concepts. Now, much of this was during the pandemic when money was cheap. And that was also the time that we had several of what are today some of the leading companies go public. They went public and they raised hundreds of millions of dollars for these projects, Joby, Archer, Vertical, Eve, those types of companies. But over the last 12 months, maybe a little bit more, it feels like things have begun to slow down, maybe even unravel. Definitely unravel for some of the firms. It started with Lilium's insolvency, which happened almost a year ago, and really that whole process is just recently wrapped up. So the question is, what has happened, Dom, to the bright future that we were promised, but that is not here yet?
Well, it really is down to money, as always, or the lack of it. Even before Lilium went bust, the market was tightening. That cheap money was drying up. I mean, if you go back to the summer of last year, a company called Overair was maybe one of the first high-profile casualties, which slimmed down and then effectively disappeared. And others were reporting that it was much harder to raise finance than before. But the collapse of such a high-profile firm like Lilium really serves as a starting point, or maybe that inflection point. And since then, we've had Airbus killing off its City Airbus next-gen concept, Volocopter entering insolvency, albeit it was later rescued by Diamond, and one or two others like Chrysallian or Supernal that have either gone or are on hold. The problem is that aerospace engineering is always hard, and physics is very unforgiving. Big, complex projects always take longer than you think. I mean, you could just ask Boeing how well the 777X is going. But you throw in a completely new energy source, a completely new architecture, and it turns out that, yes, it's much more challenging than you thought at the start of the project. And it will cost infinitely more than you thought it was going to. I think a lot of companies forgot this, or thought this new agile, dare I say it, Silicon Valley type approach would mean that those traditional aerospace rules might not apply.
Right, that's a good point. And it makes me think that the folks over at Boom Supersonic, who are developing that supersonic airliner, have said that they have a engineering strategy that is quick and agile, and they also think that they can move quickly through certification and development of both the engine and the aircraft. So that is a theme that these companies are pushing. The other thing that I was thinking was that I've been told by several analysts that the first few companies that break through and actually do manage to certificate an eVTOL, an electric air taxi, a passenger carrying aircraft, that those companies will likely have to spend $1 billion, maybe even more, to make this work, which is a tremendous amount of money for, well, particularly a small company.
Those kind of figures sound reasonable. I mean, Lilium spent, I think it was $1.5 billion or euros, I suppose the difference is negligible, and didn't even have a flying prototype. So while a company like Airbus or Boeing can absorb these extra costs because they've got revenues coming in from all their traditional products, if you're a little startup existing largely on your wits and the Google of investors with nothing else coming through the door, well, it doesn't take a maths genius to work out what happens in the end, which is sort of why you're seeing companies like Beta developing a conventional takeoff aircraft first, because that will get to market much quicker. It's much simpler. And the revenues from that can then be used to fund the development of the vertical takeoff version. And even if you look at Archer and Joby, which are much, much better funded than any others out there, their resources are finite as well. I looked at their financial filings, and at the end of June, Archer said it had about 12 months cash left. Joby roughly the same, maybe slightly more. So what every company in this space needs is to reach certification and start bringing in revenue. But when that point is still very much up for debate, although I'd be prepared to bet a lot of money, probably someone else's, hopefully some investors, that it won't be this year.
Yeah, Dom, that's a good point. I hadn't realized that Lilium spent $1.5 billion, an incredible amount of money, to develop an aircraft that never even flew, and that will presumably now get mothballed and maybe never fly. I mean, you mentioned Lilium was the first victim in this process of consolidation, and I believe Archer just picked up its assets, but what's the future of the Lilium jet?
I don't think it has a future, certainly not in the short term. Archer bought something like 300 patents from Lilium's administrator for about $21 million, which is pocket change in the wider context. But tellingly, the deal didn't include the Lilium jet prototypes. So for me, that says Archer has zero interest right now, and probably can't afford anyway, in trying to develop a second aircraft alongside its Midnight. So this acquisition was much more about picking up some useful patents and arguably keeping them out of a rival's hands. The other credible bidder in this process was Joby. So there's no grand ambition for the Lilium jet. And from what I understand, anyway, the battery technology just wasn't ready to support the Lilium jet's power use. And maybe that happens at some point in the future, but why would Archer take the risk right now?
Right. I've also heard from various people who sort of talk off the record and just chit chat that the battery technology is perhaps not where it's said to be, and whether or not these aircraft will be able to perform routinely the type of missions that they've been advertised as is still an open question, as is the question of whether the battery technology can ever, or anytime soon, get to a point where the type of operations are possible, regular routine operations with quick charging. And then there's also the issue of having to replace the batteries after X number of charges. You touched on Volocopter. Tell me or remind me what happened there.
Well, it went into insolvency at roughly the same time as Lilium, maybe a month or so behind it. I think there was a feeling at the time that it both would go the same way. No buyer would be found. Both would close before any product entered service. But Volocopter was actually acquired by Diamond Aircraft earlier this year. And while there's no guarantee that the Volocity will be a success, there are still plenty of questions, as you just raised, around the design, market demand, and so on and so forth. But at least with Diamond as a new owner, it has backing, particularly around the certification aspects. Diamond really knows what it's doing in terms of certifying new products. Just look at the number of new aircraft or derivatives that it's brought in over the last decade. So it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier, that actually what does matter is traditional aerospace expertise. You can't certify an aircraft without that.
That is the same argument that the folks at Eve make about being owned or majority owned by Embraer. And Embraer has this stellar record of certifying aircraft, having done, something like, I'm going to get the number wrong, but 8 aircraft in the last, 10 years, and having brought all those through certification essentially on time and getting it done. And Eve's going to rely heavily on all that expertise. You also mentioned uncertain demand for the types of operations that air taxis will perform. McKinsey was forecasting just a few years ago that this market will be generating billions of dollars every year by 2030. These eVTOL companies, certainly they can't be gambling on a field of dreams business model, where if they build it, the market will come. Is that what they're doing?
It sometimes feels like it, doesn't it? And You alluded to some of the problems earlier. A lot of the predictions or the modelling seem to be based on developing an aircraft that delivers exactly the performance being claimed, the speed, the range, the payload, and that can be operated much more cheaply than any alternative. But if you look at the list price of a 4-passenger eVTOL against that of a similar sized helicopter like a Bell 505 or a Robinson R66, you're probably talking about 4 times as much. So that's a lot of ground to make up straight off. And that's if you can match or beat the passenger seat mile metrics of a helicopter. There's a whole bunch of other issues like insurance, pilot costs, landing fees, residual values, battery replacement costs, so on and so forth. David Smith, who's the chief executive of Robinson Helicopter, articulates this so much better than I do. Check him out on LinkedIn. He always has something interesting to say. These all need to be overcome. And I'm making the assumption that airspace regulation and management is all sorted too, and that everything can be certificated as planned. These tiny details that may matter just a touch. So for me, the jury's still out. I'm not dismissing eVTOL's potential, but it feels like we're a little way from any concrete proof that they will do what they say just yet. Maybe I'm approaching this with too much of a European head on. Is there a different view in the USA? Are we going to see aircraft from Joby and Archer flying around New York or LA in the next few years?
Well, from the US perspective, I think that your take is pretty much spot on. It's what we're seeing over here and what we're thinking over here in the US. Dom and I and other FlightGlobal reporters were at MBAA last week in Las Vegas, and a company called Blade Air Mobility, which as of this year is owned by Joby. Blade was offering helicopter flights between the Las Vegas Convention Center and Henderson Field, where the static display is held. And Blade was going back and forth these helicopters all day long. And this is the type of model that Joby wants to bring to electric air taxis. And the price of getting on one of these helicopters and going 10 minutes over to Henderson Field was something like $245. I'm not sure if that was round trip, and there was a discount if you were an MBAA member, but I just hopped in a taxi with 2 other people and it was $52 and we were at Henderson Field in 25 minutes. That's tough to compete with. And yes, the air taxi developers say that they're going to bring the price down significantly more than helicopters. And if they can do that, then there's a lot of optimism in their business case. But it's unclear whether they can. You just mentioned how cheap some of these helicopters are. And the cost of certifying the electric aircraft is immense. Whether or not they can sell them at a price that then the aircraft can be operated at a relatively cheap price, and whether that can all translate into something that can generate mass interest from many people who would otherwise just take a ground taxi is far from clear. And you also mentioned the questions of certification, and a lot of these companies, maybe most of the bigger ones, are working through certification with the FAA and also EASA and other regulators. The FAA, to its credit, has taken some steps in helping the air taxi companies. The last year, the FAA rolled out what was an operational and pilot training rules. They called it their powered lift aircraft rule. And this was to specify how training and how pilots would be trained and how air taxis would be operated. And it's a big step in the right direction. Also, the administration of U.S. President Donald Trump has made supporting the eVTOL sector among its top priorities. And then in June of this year, the FAA took another step when it rolled out what it called its air taxi certification roadmap. That document was an agreement between the U.S. and several other companies in which they committed to collaborate to establish certification requirements for air taxis. So a real step in the right direction, but that document itself also highlighted the degree to which a lot of work needs to be done. All these countries aren't even aligned yet. So that needs to happen. So the bottom line is the FAA hasn't yet certified any aircraft. It remains unclear when it might do so. And Dom, you mentioned that the FAA has its hands full. It is certifying Boeing's 777-8, or rather 9. It is trying to certify Boeing 737 MAX 7 and MAX 10. Those programs are all years late. Beechcraft Denali, that's several years late and still in the certification process. So How much resources the FAA can put toward this, when they can get these air taxis certified remains unclear.
But if the process in the USA is so slow, are Archer and Joby looking elsewhere to get some money coming through the door a bit earlier?
They are. They have talked about delivering what appear to be pre-certification aircraft to operators and countries in places like Indonesia and the United Arab Emirates. And the plan seems to be to have the aircraft operated in those places first before it's certified by the FAA or EASA. Now, we don't know many details about this, and those plans have received some criticism for circumventing the traditional certification process. It would be rather unique to do it that way. The air taxi developers, meanwhile, have said this is an opportunity to start proving out the safety and the business case before they achieve certification. So we'll see what happens there. And we've nearly got to the end of this discussion, and there's been no mention of the UK's own vertical aerospace. Dom, what is happening with vertical?
Well, vertical is interesting. It's not as well capitalized as the big US two, but it's not spending as much either. It also doesn't plan to enter service until 2028, possibly later, but we'll see. But that being said, it will still need to raise more funds again before the end of the year. If memory serves, its reserves currently take it to around the middle of 2026. And it would be embarrassing on so many levels if it ran out of cash ahead of a planned Farnborough Airshow debut in July next year. But it does have a critical milestone it needs to pass before the end of this year, or it's promised to anyway, transitioning its VX4 prototype from thrust-borne to wing-borne flight, which is a pretty critical maneuver for any eVTOL aircraft. Vertical is also meant to fly a second prototype shortly, although that seems to have been the case since the spring. Interestingly, though, it sent out an invite last week to an event at the start of December for what it says will be the unveiling of its new aircraft. An all-new development seems unlikely given the finances, so it's more likely a production representative version of the VX4, or a more refined prototype, if you like. Mind you, the company did spring us the surprise of a hybrid powertrain earlier this year, so another ta-da moment isn't entirely beyond the bounds of possibility.
Interesting, and we will see more, and we also will learn more in the next few weeks when some of the publicly traded companies, Archer and Joby are among them, are going to be releasing their third quarter results. We will see how much money they have left, how much money they've spent, and we will also see if they'll give an update on when certification might happen and whether there'll be any changes to the timeline. That's about all the time we have, so Dom, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
FlightGlobal publishes new episodes of this podcast twice weekly. Join us on Friday for a concise news briefing and Monday for an in-depth analysis covering airlines, defense, and aerospace. FlightGlobal Focus is a production of FlightGlobal with audio editing by Lucy Johnson. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or for commercial opportunities, please email podcast@flightglobal.com, and more information can be found in the show notes. Listeners can also access 20% off your new subscription to FlightGlobal with the code FGPodcast. Terms and conditions apply. Listen, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.